All right, so in this tutorial, we're going to go ahead and get started on the JavaScript portion of our series. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is create a script.js file. All right. Now let's go ahead and go into the login.html file. And above the closing body tag, I want you to put a script tag. Okay. And the source attribute is going to be equal to script.js. Go ahead and save that. And I want you to copy it and put it in your signup.html in the exact same spot, directly above the closing body tag. Save that. Go ahead and close that file because for now we're just going to work with the login.html. This is, by the end of the video, both of them are going to be working, the login and the signup. But what we're going to essentially be doing in this video is we're going to be displaying only one step of the login process, and we're going to be able to click next, and it's going to go to the very next step in the process. And once you get to the end, next is not going to do anything. So go ahead and make sure everything's saved inside of your script.js file. Let's just make sure it's connected properly. Put console.log, and inside of here, just put hello. Save it. I want you to refresh and look down here and make sure that you see hello here. If you do, then it's connected properly. If you did not see that, you're going to have to go back in here and see if you may have put a typo or something. Once you get that done, let's go ahead and get started. So what we're going to do is we're going to be creating a class, and the class is going to be called AppForm. And what we're going to be doing in order to initiate this program is we're going to be calling new AppForm here at the bottom. And when we create an instance, this is an instance of this class, we call this an object. When we create an object from a class, the first thing that gets called is the constructor. And this gets called automatically as soon as we create this instance. So inside of here, just put console.log, I am constructed. And then you can see now that I am constructed is being logged here, so we know that this is working as expected. So since the constructor gets called automatically as soon as the object is created, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to use this to initialize some variables and initiate some functions. So we're going to start by creating some variables. This.form, and we're going to use the this keyword so that the variables belong to that class, that object. So when we say AppForm, when we create AppForm, these variables are going to belong to this object. So we're going to make that an empty array. We're going to have this.step, and we're going to set that equal to 0, and then we're going to have this.currentGroup. Set that to null for now. Now I want to just go ahead and define these now so that you can easily see which variables exist within this class by looking at the top of the constructor here. So as we can probably tell, this.step is going to represent which step in the login process or the sign-up process that we're currently on, and it's a number. Now I want you to remember something. We created this data step thing here, and this is a string, so we're actually going to have to convert it from a string to a number when we're working with it in JavaScript. But just remember that that's what this is. That's why we went in here and did this. Now I'm going to explain this really quick, okay? So when we come in here and we say data hyphen anything at all, so I could put LOL hello and then set that equal to sup. And basically when I go into here and I say, you know, this element dot dataset dot LOL hello, that would equal sup in this case. And so what we're doing here is we're essentially creating variables on these elements. That's one way to think about it. So I just wanted you to understand that before we get too much further into this tutorial. So now we have some variables initialized. One of the very first things that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to set our event listeners for our next button so that whenever we click it, we can actually do stuff. So let's go ahead and create a function called setListeners. And all we're going to do is we're going to say document.getElementById. And the ID of the next button is literally next button. Let's look inside the login.html page, and we can see that the next button's ID is next button. So we're accessing that, and then we're going to say .add event listener. We're going to listen for clicks. And whenever we get a click, we're going to want to call a function that we're going to call refresh. So let's call this.refresh. Let's go ahead and create that function really quick. And inside of here, I'm just going to put console.log refreshing. And so when I click next now, nothing's going to happen. And that's because we have not called set listeners inside of the constructor yet. So go ahead and call that in the constructor. And now when I click next, you can see refreshing is being logged here in the console each time I click it. Now we have the set listeners, but we're also going to want to be able to remove the event listener, because when we disable the button, we're not going to want to be listening for clicks anymore. And we're going to be disabling the button when the form is not valid, or if we're on the very last step and we want to submit the login rather than going to the next step. So we're going to create a function called remove listeners. And go ahead and copy this. It's going to be basically the exact same thing, but instead of add event listener here, we're going to remove add and type in remove. Now you can save it. Now we're not going to be using this this function in this tutorial, but it's good to go ahead and set it up because we're going to be using it in another tutorial. So let's go ahead and figure out what we need to do next. I think what we should do is we should go ahead and the very first thing we do inside of refresh, we should say this.step ++, and that increments the step. Right now it's 0. So what I want to do is, instead of logging refresh here, I want to log this.step. So when we call refresh, we're going to increment step by 1, and then we're going to log it just to see that it goes up by 1 each time you click the next button. So in the console here, watch what happens when I click the next button. You can see that it's incrementing by 1 each time I click it, which is exactly what we want. So I'm going to save this, and we're going to come back to the refresh function shortly. But what I want to do is I want to go ahead and initiate this form array. Now what this is going to be is we're going to create a custom object that's going to have a step, an element, and an input. And I'll show you exactly what that means. But for now, I'll just kind of explain it as we go through. So let's create a function called getForm. And what we're going to do is we're going to start by creating a variable called groups. And the groups variable is going to be each and every single form group inside of this login form. For instance, as you can see here, we have this class form group that we're using to basically, it's Bootstrap, but it's a good way to say, hey, this is a form group and this is a form group. And we want to access each of these elements, so we can use this form group class to do that. Let's set it equal to document.getElements by class name. The class name was form group. And I'm going to go ahead and log groups to kind of show you what that looks like. But we have to call it in the constructor, so get form, and it has to be this.getForm, don't forget that. Save it, and now you can see here I'm logging it, and it's an HTML collection. It's not an array, it's an HTML collection, so we can't call array methods on it like for each and find and every and all of those array functions that I love so much. So let's convert this groups to an array. Let's say array.from open parenthesis, and then on the other side, go ahead and close it, save it, and now you can see when it's logged, it's actually an array. So we can actually come in here and say groups.forEach, and we want to loop through these groups, and for each group, we want to do some stuff. Now, what is it we want to do? Well, we want to grab the individual items from this group and let me show you what that looks like. So let's start with the email group. So I'm hovering over email, and you can see over here on the web page that it's highlighted. You can see which group that represents. So if I expand this and I go to the children property right here, and I expand that, you can see that I have both the label and the input. So we want to grab these children and create an array from this HTML collection, okay? So let's do that first. Let's create a variable called children and set it equal to array.from, and we're going to say group, the current group we're on, .children. And if I log that, you can see here that it's each individual one now. So I actually have access to each individual label and input for each group. For each, okay? So with that being said, what is it we want to do? Well, we want to go ahead and push, so we're going to say this.form, that's this array up here that we initialized, this.form.push, and we want to push a new item to that array. What is it we want to push to that array? We want to create an object. So inside of here, put 2 curly braces. And remember, the 3 things that we want to create for this object is a step, an element, and an input. The step is going to be which step in the login process is it. For instance, for this form group, which is the email, the step is 1. For this form group, which is the password, the step is 2. We want to use that. So we're going to say step. For now, I'm going to set it to 0 because I'm going to come back and actually populate this with the correct data, but I just want to explain what each property is. The element, which is going to be the actual form group element itself, which for now I'll put null. We'll come back to it in a second. And then, like I said, input, which is going to be the input itself. So if we are on group 1, step 1, then the input would be this input. If we're on the second group, the input would be this input. So let's go ahead and set these properly. So instead of 0, what we want to do is we want to grab the data step for the group we're on. In this case, it's 1. But this is a string, so we're going to want a number.parseInt that. So what I mean by that is we're going to say number.parseInt, and we're going to say group because that is the variable that we are creating as we loop through each item. Group.dataset.step. Okay, so dataset allows us to access each and every single one of these data hyphen variables that we create. So dataset.step, or again, if I put data.helloworld equals hi, then dataset.helloworld would equal hi in that case. Okay, so dataset.step, and then we're parsing it from a string to a number. Element is going to be the group element itself, so we're just going to set that equal to group. The input. Now this is where it gets interesting. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to go back to logging the group that we're on. So go ahead, and you don't have to do this part. I'm just going to do this to demonstrate what it is we're doing here. So not like that though. Let me log it up here. Okay, so let's say we're on the email group, and I expand this, and we go down to the children. Okay, now we have a label and an input. How do we find the input? We don't want the label. We want only the input because we're calling it input. We want that input. So how can we distinguish between these two and only extract the input? Well, there's this property inside of each child called, let's see, what is it called? It's called node name. Node name. So in this case, node name is label. In the inputs case, it's going to be input. Let's look here. Input. Well, no, that's local name. Sorry. Input right here. It's in all caps. So what we want to do in order to extract the input is we're going to want to use an array function on the children array that we created right here. So we're going to say children.find, and for each element, we want to find the element with the node name value equal to input. And I read it as I said it out loud as I typed it so you could understand. So I'll say it one more time. For each and every single item inside children, we want to find the element where the element's node name value is equal to input. It's going to find the first item inside of this children array where this is equal to true, and it's going to return it. So at the end here, I'm going to go ahead and log console.log this.form, save it, and let's see what we have. We have an array. We have an array of objects, and we have an array of objects where we have the element, which is the group. We have the input. When I hover over this, you can see just the input only is being highlighted, and we have the step, which is equal to 1. And this one should be 2. Step is equal to 2. Correct. So we are officially good with our getForm function. I can remove my console.log statements and save. And so now what it is we want to do is we also want to display, we want the ability to display a step. So like I said, we only want to display one step at a time, but when I click next and I increment this.step, we want to go through and hide all of the steps and only display the one that we're on. So we're going to create a function called display step. And inside of here, we're going to say if this dot current group, if this dot current group is a truthy value, in other words, if it's not null, and it's a truthy value. If you don't know what truthy means, we'll just ask me in the comments and I'll explain it. I'll direct you to a video on what truthy values are. But we're going to say this dot current group dot style dot display, not display step, dot display is equal to none. Now what is that doing? So if we actually have a current group, we're going to say this dot current group, and then we're going to access the style for that current group, which is going to be an element, the style for the current group element, and we're going to set the display property to none. In other words, we're making it hidden. Then we're going to say this dot current group. So this is if the current group already exists. We'll go ahead and make it disappear. And then whatever's after this is going to apply no matter what. We're going to go ahead and say this dot current group is equal to this dot form dot find, which I went over find just a moment ago. And we're going to iterate through each group because each item inside of the form, each object that we created is essentially a group. And we're going to say if group dot step, which is this thing that we created right here, is equal to this dot step, then we know we have the right group. We know we're on the right group. And we want to return that and set it equal to this dot group. And then what we're going to do is we're going to make it visible. And to do that, we're going to say this dot current group dot style dot display is equal to block, and save it. And so what this is going to do is it's going to go through, it's going to set the current group that is being displayed equal to its display equal to none, so it makes it hidden. And then we're going to go into the this.forms array, and we're going to set the current group equal to the one that we're on currently, and we're going to make it visible. That's what this display step function is doing. So now we're going to have to call this display step function inside of our refresh function. Okay. So the first thing that we're doing inside of refresh is we're saying this.step plus plus. We're incrementing it by 1. Then what we want to do is just say this.display step. And so if you remember, we call this.step, we set it equal to 0 in the beginning. There is no 0 step. It's the very first step is 1. So what's going to end up happening is when I come in here and say this.refresh within the constructor, the first thing that's going to happen is it's going to call this.step plus plus, and it's going to increment it to 1. And then it's going to say this.display step. It's going to find step 1 and display it. Let's hope that works. All right, save. And we have an error. It says cannot set property display of undefined on line 21. Let's see what we did wrong here. All right, so what I did wrong here is on this line right here, I'm returning the entire object with find. Instead, I just want to return dot element, which is this group element right here that we set, this property here. I was returning the entire group instead of the element itself. So add dot element to this line and click save, and that error message will go away. So the problem here is that all of these are displayed, and the reason why is because we don't have a current group in the beginning, and so it's not setting anything to none. It's null in the beginning, and it's not setting anything to none. So what we need to do is by default, we have to go and set all of these to be display of none, just by default. So in style.css, go ahead and add .form group and set the display equal to none by default. And so when I save it, you can see the only thing that's being displayed here is enter your email. When I click next, now it's enter your password. When I click next again, though, we get an error because we're not checking to see whether or not we're on the very last step. So there is no third step in the login process. So it increments it to 3, and it can't find the current group anymore, and we get an error. So what we want to do is inside of the refresh function, we want to check to see whether or not we're on the last step. So let's go ahead and do that. So how are we going to check whether or not we're on the last step? Well, we'll have an if statement. And inside of here, we'll say if this.step is less than or equal to this.form.length, then we want to go ahead and say this.display step. Otherwise, we'll say else, we want to say this.submit. But we don't have a submit function, so let's create it really quick. Let's say submit. And all I want to do here is just console.log. I'm going to say submit in all caps so that we can see in the console that it is supposed to submit at that point. All right, so let's click next. So enter your email is the only thing here. Click next, enter your password, click next, and now you see submit. So that is all for this tutorial, but let me go ahead and quickly demonstrate the sign up just to make sure that both work. So as you can see here, we have enter your email. I click next, confirm your email, click next. Then we have the password requirements that we created and create a password. Click next, confirm your password, click next, and you see submit here. So in the next tutorial, what we're gonna go over is we're gonna actually hook up the back button, and we're going to create form validation so that when I type in stuff here, it will not allow me to click next until I actually enter a valid email. And then when I go here, if I type in a password and then I click next and I type in confirm my password and I type in the wrong password, it will not let me click next. So that's what we're gonna do in the very next tutorial. All right, guys, if you enjoyed this, please subscribe, give me a like, and I'll see you next time.